Well, the recruiting success has been pretty abundant for Dan Lanning and company, meaning the immediate future for Oregon football appears to be in pretty good shape. But what about the long term future? We'll discuss today with Mark Rogers, voice of college football on YouTube, on the show for the first time today. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching this show, which is brought to you today by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. And those of you on YouTube can see I am not alone today. I'm joined for the first time by Mark Rogers. He is at Mark Rogers TV on Twitter. He is the voice of CFB on YouTube and podcasting platforms, I assume. I take in your show on YouTube, so I assume you're on podcast, but I never know. I'll defer to you there, Mark. But it's great to have you on the show, and we will get into all of the conference realignment talk today.
Spencer, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to be here talking some ball as we are concluding talking season, getting into fall camp here pretty soon. But yeah, you can catch me on all the major audio platforms. Just search Mark Rogers TV or the voice of college football.
Well, it's great to have you on. Let's hop into it. Let's backtrack a little bit to a completely different world of about 3 weeks ago, when this realignment news had not hit the airwaves, and we didn't know, and everything was just proceeding along. And we were following recruiting this summer. We were doing season preview stuff and talking about rosters and player development and quarterbacks and the transfer portal. And NIL and the transfer portal have taken like 5 back seats in the headlines to all of this conference realignment news. So when that first came out, Mark, what was your initial reaction as somebody who covers the Pac-12 pretty regularly?
Well, to take us back 12 months, my initial reaction to Oklahoma, Texas is, okay, this is really good for content. It's really good for storylines. It's great discussion. It's great conversation. But is it good for college football? And my answer is no, it's not good for college football. I think that this sport is Americana, unlike other sports, professional sports. And I think much of what we root for in college football is those regions, those cultures where the football is played. There's a certain culture to the Pac-12. There's a certain culture to the SEC, the Big Ten, et cetera, that is tied to that region, the way people live in that region, what their values are, what food they like to eat, how they live, what music they like. All that's reflected on college football Saturdays. But when you suddenly have the Big Ten extending from coast to coast, and even prior to that, the Plains, the Dust Bowl of the Big 12 moving into the SEC with Missouri and Texas A&M, and all the changes that have existed and have occurred over the last 10 to 12 years, and then it just continues to get amplified. I think that fabric of college football, that regionality that makes it so interesting for a team from the Big Ten to play the Pac-12 in the Rose Bowl, or a Big Ten power to play the SEC, is kind of getting stretched and pretty much torn apart at this point.
Do you think that it'll ever? I mean, obviously the realignment and the merging of conferences and teams and moving around and such. Do you think that it'll ever just feel completely different, or to what you're talking about is something that I feel as well. Like I said recently on the show, I consume college football as a regional product first and then as a national one. I enjoy it as a national product. Like don't get me wrong. I want to know how, a given Oregon game is going to affect their standing in the national college football landscape. But do you think that for people like us who have been fans of college football, most of our lives and have that ingrained feeling of what college football feels like and what it's like to root for a team on a Saturday, do you think that that's something that is just going to start to feel really different, or do you think it'll be there, internally for us and it'll just look different?
Well, I do think that the next several moves that are being rumored, which you would have to think that some of it is going to take place at some point, whether that be a year from now or 3 to 5 years from now, is going to continue to tear at that fabric. But maybe there's something off in the distance to where if this whole SEC Big Ten power struggle narrative of two super conferences really comes to fruition to the nth degree, then it does become the NFC and the AFC. But it kind of goes back to the originality of, well, we're going to divide the AFC slash SEC or the Big Ten, the NFC, into divisions and that are going to look much like what we should have and what we've had in the past, where that regional focus is back in play. But we still have great rivalries, and still most of the matchups are intact. It's just the broad scope of these regions. And then obviously the larger the conferences become, the less teams are able to play on a regular basis. It, to me, illegitimizes the conference championship to a certain extent, because when you've got 14 teams in a league and now we're up to 16 and they play 8 games where you're missing 7 opponents in the league, then the discrepancy of fairness of scheduling really comes into play. And so I kind of question that as well.
I hadn't thought about that with regards to putting a 16 or 20 or 24, whatever, however big these conferences could get, because you'd be looking at, I mean, the NFL's got what, 32 teams, so those are 16 apiece, and I think they do a better job than college football, notably. And I don't want I don't want college football to become the NFL. From a scheduling perspective, I would love it if they adopted a similar sort of mindset to where they did it on a more annualized basis, because you could create a bunch of really interesting matchups. But I think the reason that the schedule wouldn't get or would get more attention in college if you had a 16 team conference than it does in the NFL is because in the NFL you don't have rankings. You just have records and teams. And so I think it's not as easy for people to kind of visualize and capture that component of looking at a schedule and saying, wait, we have 4 top 25 preseason teams on our schedule here, and this team over here only has 2. Like how is that fair? Whereas in the NFL it's just a bunch of teams, and because quick turnarounds happen a lot easier in the NFL than college football, it's more likely that a team you think is going to be just okay ends up being pretty good, and so that win maybe looks better than you thought going into the season. And certainly not everybody lives up to their preseason hype in college football, but I hadn't thought about that component before. I think it'd be a new thing for people to harp in on and rail against the conferences about. And it's pretty easy to find those sorts of things, frankly, for fans. They haven't struggled to do it so far, but I think that's a really interesting point. But it also, on the scheduling note, Mark, allows for some opportunities, doesn't it? Because if you're going into a new age, I think there's kind of the mindset of, well, we're not going to do divisions the way we did in the past, because having a North and South division, where like the Pac-12 is doing away with that for at least the next 2 years, and we'll see if it hangs around. A discussion we'll get to a bit later in the show. But I think it allows you to kind of reset how you approach it from a conference perspective, and you could try and set up these matchups a little bit better. Like, I understand what you're saying about the downside of it, of like, well, their schedule is way easier than ours, but for us as fans, there could be some upside too, couldn't there?
So what would the upside be? Yeah, you're on the upside if your team has a much easier schedule. So this kind of slapped me in the face at various times, and now I rail on the scheduling on a regular basis, because I think the scheduling should be taken out of the hands of the individual teams from a non-conference standpoint. I think the individual teams and programs should not be scheduling their own games. And then the conferences need to be wiser in scheduling their games. So this came to light, most notably, the one example that hits me, and there are many, is one year I looked at the SEC schedule, and this was about close to 10 years ago, when Alabama and LSU were the 2 best teams in the conference. And even if they weren't, it doesn't matter. I'm not looking to load up difficult schedules on the best programs and easy schedules. I'm not looking for an NFL formula that's weighted based on record. I believe in equity and fairness. Vanderbilt should have just as difficult schedule as Alabama. They play in the same conference. They're competing for the same thing. But one year LSU played the Georgia, so you know the format. They play everyone in the same division, so they play each other, Alabama, LSU, and then they play everyone, the other 5 teams in the division. The only difference in the schedule is there are 2 crossover games in the other division. So LSU was playing Georgia and Florida that particular year, and those 2 teams were 7-1 the previous season. So they're playing 2 teams that went 14-2 the previous year, and Alabama was playing Kentucky and Vanderbilt, and the previous year they were combined 1-15. In the conference. So you have 2 teams competing for a division championship that play 6 of 8 games exactly the same, but the 2 differences, one team gets to play 2 teams that are deplorable, and the other team is playing 2 teams that are 2 of the top 5 or 10 teams in the country. Now, how is that fair? And I've got a litany of examples like that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that before. I think the upside that I was talking about, it can come into play for a football team, but for us as fans, I think the upside for scheduling, ensuring that this team plays that team, like ensuring that Alabama and Georgia play every year in the SEC, because that's a big time matchup that everybody's going to watch, even outside of those 2 particular fan bases. But I think you make a lot of interesting points about scheduling. If you want to bet anything with regards to college football scheduling, like wins and loss totals or anything of the sorts, betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events on the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball. Go Mariners. I don't know if you saw, they've won 14 in a row. Just good vibes up in Seattle right now. But every league is there: NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, even golf, my personal favorite. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action happening today. BetOnline is where the game starts. So the scheduling thing is fascinating, but before you can get to that discussion, even you have to figure out who's in what conference right now. And I want to bring this back to Oregon a little bit. When I saw USC and UCLA were leaving, I thought, well, is Oregon going to try and follow? Are they going to try and stay put? There have been rumors about the Big 12. Phil Knight apparently wants the Big 10, but the Big 10 isn't adding any more teams right now. They're seemingly content to stand pat with what they've got. So with the conferences of the Big 12 and Pac-12 having just cut off their talks about a potential full conference merger, what do you see as the next potential move for Oregon? Because I don't think it rules out the possibility the Big 12 could try and poach some schools away from the Pac-12, like Oregon and Utah. Washington would be in that mix as well, with the Arizona schools and Colorado are the ones that have been reported. What do you think Oregon's next move could be?
Well, I do think that Oregon is the gem of the teams that are in susceptible conferences. I think they are the prize. So we know that the Big Ten wants Notre Dame. Notre Dame's doing everything it can, seemingly, to stay independent, looking for alternate TV deals to try to get in that $75 to $100 million range to stay competitive in regards to TV revenue. What I'm trying to interpret is, while the Big Ten is negotiating with Notre Dame, or maybe pleading with Notre Dame, they're putting this stop sign in the face of Oregon and Washington. Now, I can only interpret that one way, and that's that if they truly wanted Oregon and Washington, obviously they would have accepted the application. The process would go through, or they would have clearly just denied them and not given them this, let's hang on and we'll get back to you at some point. I got to think that maybe Notre Dame's having some type of say in what the rest of the conference looks like, who that partner with them would be, whether they would favor a Stanford joining with them, let's say, for example. That's the only conclusion I can come to of why the Big Ten would put Oregon and Washington on hold. But meanwhile, Spencer, well, if I'm the Big 12, I'm rolling out the red carpet for Oregon in particular, but Oregon, Washington, because that's you like to bring in these teams that are not connected to your geographic region in pairs for a number of reasons that are obvious. And I would roll out the red carpet for Oregon and Washington to say, hey, you're being shunned. Do you want to, even if the Big Ten eventually allows you to join, look at how they've treated you to start out this relationship. You may be a second-class citizen in this conference, as opposed to let's roll out the red carpet and with your football brand, Washington, we can renegotiate and have a stronger football brand as a conference and do much better. So I think the Big 12 should have its number one target planted on Eugene.
Would you put Utah in there as a high priority for the Big 12 as well? Because that's a program right now in a decently sized market in Salt Lake City, not huge, but as a football program, it's a very big deal up there. I live in the southern part of Utah, and I've been to that area. I know Utah football is very, very popular up there. They sell out Rice-Eccles Stadium every single time. I think they have like 70 straight sellouts or something. Like it's a very rabid, passionate fan base, and that's a program right now with Kyle Whittingham that feels like it's on the upswing. And so the six schools have been kind of tied to this potential breakoff, right, which would just doom the Pac-12 conference altogether. And I don't know if it would survive unless they did a merger with everybody else in the Mountain West. I guess that's how it would look. But that to me feels like a situation where if you're the Big 12 and you really want to go after aggressive expansion and they said no to the Pac-12, it seems to me because they didn't want to take on everybody. They didn't want Washington State, Oregon State, Stanford, and Cal. They just are kind of looking for who they perceive as the most valuable schools there. And of the six, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, the Arizona schools, I could see a situation where maybe it's not all six, but maybe it's two, maybe it's four, maybe somehow it's three if they add another random school, but typically this is all done in even numbers. I feel like that's, I agree with you that of the Pac-10 schools that are remaining, Oregon would be the strongest football brand to bring in there. But I feel like Utah is a program that right now, if you add it to your conference, would bring a lot to the table.
Absolutely. Like you on posting videos and seemingly can't post enough videos because people can't get enough of this expansion talk. So
It's fascinating. I find it
it
fascinating.
is.
I had someone send me a message the other day asking a question about it, like, hey, I know you're probably tired of this. And I came back with like, dude, I'm not tired of this. I can't. Every time you go down an avenue on all this stuff, you think of like three other branches
Yep.
about how things could play out because some of it's speculative. You mix that in with reporting, and there's just so many ways that this thing can go.
Yeah, because every time you go down a path, to your point, okay, add Oregon, Washington to the Big Ten. Okay, how are you going to divide the conference, the divisions, the scheduling? Okay, let's go down that path. Oh, if it's not Oregon, Washington, if it's Notre Dame, Stanford, boom, they're on the Big Ten. Okay, how do we attack that? So back to the Big 12 situation. So I consider the priorities, and there are various facets to that. We're football guys, we're talking football, but we've got obviously market sizes that you alluded to in Salt Lake City that obviously equal TV dollars, digital hits, all that, because they're rear ends in the seats, and by extension, they're people in front of their phones and laptops or TVs. And then there's also an academic component that we've addressed on my channel a number of times, not because I know anything about it, but because I bring people on that know something about it. We'll leave that alone to a certain extent, which makes kind of Stanford the Alabama of
Yeah,
academics,
yeah.
if you're going to go that route. And we know that that's important to the Big Ten to a certain extent, maybe not so much to the Big 12, but just to kind of prioritize the pairings as I see them. And I do agree with you that's been the history of expansion, has been these pairings of Missouri and Texas A&M, Rutgers, Maryland, et cetera, is that Oregon and Washington would be my priority, and Colorado, Utah, because of Utah, would be my priority. And secondly, and then I go to Arizona, Arizona State. And if I can bring in all six, even though that seems kind of like a enormous conference, I think maybe the Big 12's opportunity here is, while they can't match the Big Ten or the SEC in terms of elite programs, kind of kill it with quantity and continue to make yourself relevant, because you're going to have, what are they going to be up to at that point? 18? I think
If
they'd
they
be up
added
to,
four, if they added four, I think that, or if they added two, I think that'd be 18. I don't know why they call it the Big 12. I guess Big 14 or Big 16 doesn't roll off the tongue. Like
well, they started with
I mean,
12, of
the
course, but
Pac, yeah, the Pac went from the Pac 8 to the Pac 10 to the Pac 12, and then the Big 12 and the Big 10 add more than that number in their conference, and they're still the Big 10 and the Big 12.
yes.
I don't entirely get that. I guess it's because they both have big in their name. So if one changes, then you'd be like, then people would be asking like, wait, the Big 18, is that the former Big 10 or is that the former Big 12? And it would just be kind of a mess like that, I guess.
I let them off the hook, especially the Big Ten, just considering, okay, it's a brand name at this point. It hasn't been 10 since 1991. So, it's a brand name, and they could be 24, and it's always going to be the Big Ten. Um, so yeah, the Salt Lake City example, I think, is a good one, because I think, in addition to just looking at market size, and Salt Lake City's around 30, it's always also important, and this is a feather in Utah's cap, that it's a non-NFL city market size.
Hmm.
That's crazy about Utah football and BYU.
And
But
that's different from Seattle, which has, got a lot of rabid football fans and sports fans in general for sure, but you're dividing the attention between Washington and the Seahawks. And so
exactly.
it's not that Seattle isn't an appealing market in that sense, but that is a consideration when you're talking about like, well, what sort of fan base are we adding here? Salt Lake City, it's all Utes.
And you're not dividing it 50-50
No. No,
in
no.
Seattle.
You most definitely are not. I get this sense, and I'd like your thoughts on this as well, that, in all this talk, I, as an Oregon fan, have felt that whatever the next step is going to be, whether one day it's the Big Ten or maybe it's an ACC merger. I've talked about that a little recently. I think there's some intrigue there. I'm sure Oregon fans would love to play Mario Cristobal once every couple of years or so. I know we'd be down with all of that. But or it's the Big 12, or even if it's staying foot in or staying pat in the Pac-12. To me, it feels like Oregon has put themselves in a position as a program where their brand is going to be strong enough across whatever conference they end up in, to where they're going to be able to continue to recruit at a high level as they have been, and then also, be able to win at a pretty high level, and just compete and stay relevant the way they have been for, most of my life. And my dad, who went to Oregon, has done well to remind me of the fact that that was not always the case for Oregon football. And then when he was there in college, 4 wins was like a pretty good season. Nowadays, we have 4 wins. We fire a coach who we just gave an extension to. So I feel like no matter what, Oregon is going to be able to find a way to succeed in every facet of their football program. Do you have that sense?
Yeah, I think that Oregon has, of course, this success, this run of success that you've alluded to, has kind of come incrementally. Mike Bellotti had a tremendous program, but it
So
wasn't
good.
an elite program.
Hmm.
Rich Brooks going to the Rose Bowl back in the 90s against Penn State. And then Chip Kelly obviously accelerated it. I don't know that, because of what happened in the NFL and what happened for the first few seasons at UCLA, the chapter's not closed, of course, that he doesn't get the credit, and people have forgotten how dominant Oregon was. They came within a last second field goal of winning the national championship, or
Dyer was
continuing.
down. Sorry,
Yes.
I have you had
Yeah.
every time that comes up, every Oregon fan's got to say that. That's just happened. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's I would expect no less. Yes, you should chime in with that one. And I still spit out the numbers because I repeat them all the time when I get in these conversations. 33-3 in 4 seasons in the conference, and 46-7. That was Chip Kelly's record. They were dominant, and now they're back to being a top 10 to 15 program
Yeah,
as
very
it
good.
stands. And then the Phil Knight component can't even be measured. We can measure it by dollars, I guess, but in regards to Oregon, has carved out this unique brand that people recognize if they pay any attention to college football. That, oh yeah, even when everybody now has these alternate uniforms and all this going on, it's still Oregon's the one that everyone remembers being the originator.
Because they were first. They were
Yeah.
first with it. Yeah, I agree. And I think that whatever conference Oregon is in, people know what they are and they'll be able to compete. And I think that's true for some other schools as well. Like I think you put Utah in any of these conferences with the way Kyle Whittingham has been running that program, they're going to succeed. But other Pac schools right now, and we'll just call it the Pac because 10, 12, who knows? The other Pac schools that are there, Stanford, if they're not able to turn around this season, I think they might. But if they aren't, that could be a program that starts trending down because they have trouble adding in the transfer portal because of their standards. Cal hasn't had a rich tradition of winning since Jeff Tedford was there. Really, it's been quite a struggle for them. Oregon State and Washington State, if you put them in a bigger conference with more good teams, I think it becomes harder for them to win. I think Washington can go either way because they're the last Pac-12 team to get to the college football playoff, but they're also the last Pac-12 team to have if 12 and 0 is undefeated, then I guess you call it a defeated season, right? I mean, like they have hit some really, really low points as a program, and so if you put them in a stronger, deeper conference, remains to be seen with Kalen DeBoer whether or not that's something that's going to easily translate to winning. Whereas like with Utah, I think it's there. The Arizona schools, I think they'd be in the same spot basically, which is like occasionally they could win 8 or 9 games, or maybe have a year like Arizona did where they get to the Fiesta Bowl, but on the whole, they're just kind of, middling and underwhelming. A friend of mine who went to ASU, I went down to visit him in the state of Arizona, and I'd never been to the campus before, so we were walking around, and he was just semi disgusted at where the program has gone in terms of recruiting. He's just walking around going like, "Look at this place. How can you not recruit here? like what am I missing?" And I was like, yeah, you got a good point. Why can't you recruit a little better there? Plus Arizona's got a lot of players there. But I feel like Oregon would be all right. Last thing I want to ask you about real quick here is not on the realignment front with Mark Rogers, the voice of college football on YouTube, and at Mark Rogers TV is the Twitter handle. We still have a Pac-12 right now for 2022. I know that this is very hard to remember sometimes, but there are going to be 12 teams playing the Pacific Coast Conference this year and next year as well. I know, shocking news, and I think it's important to just point that out every now and then. But overall, your expectations for Oregon this year: Dan Lanning, a new coach; Bo Nix, probably going to be a new quarterback. You've got a lot of the roster returning, but all this stuff is a little bit more futuristic in terms of the discussion for the Oregon football program compared to what is about to happen in just a few weeks. We're less than 50 days away from college football, and Oregon has a chance to win a conference championship. What do you expect from them going into this year?
Well, Spencer, I've got to be careful because I've got like 25 team channels and we do 10 team specific live streams. And sometimes the contributors I have that are professionals, but at the same time, they're fans of those teams. They talking to them on a regular basis kind of impacts me. And I got to guard against that because I've been lured into thinking, oh, Nebraska's going to be really good this year.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
Heard that one before.
yes. Dan Lanning, and I bring that up because I still remember watching Dan Lanning's introductory news conference, and I'm not the guy that, for regardless of what I'm doing, and should be doing this more often, watching introductory news conferences. But I watched Dan Lanning's. I got pulled in on him, and I thought it was exhilarating, intriguing. I thought he really sold himself and the program in a genuine way. And obviously the optimism just exudes from any new coach when they take the podium for the first time, but it was just different. I have a lot of optimism for the Oregon program under Dan Lanning. I think it's been impressive that he has not given up on the relationships and the roots that he's established in the Southeast in regards to recruiting. He's still going to go after exceptional players down there that he's scouted, recruited, built relationships with, and not been like, oh, well, we can't bring that caliber of player out of the Southeast and bring them to Oregon. He's gone for it and been successful. And so I don't know that this season is going to be any kind of banner season. It's typically difficult to win big, but considering the conference schedule and the talent on the roster, which I would say before the offseason, I would have called it the best roster in the conference with what USC's done. I would now say it's probably the second best. Utah's obviously a factor in the way they develop players. You can't even go with the recruiting rankings on Utah. They develop so well.
Yep.
But Bo Nix, as you mentioned to me before we started, and um, didn't need to enlighten me on this because you said things that I was like, yeah, this is what I've been talking about with Bo Nix and been hearing about Bo Nix from Auburn fans and just college football fans since he started. Like, this guy is one of the most recognizable names in college football. Like, you don't have to be a big college football fan to know who Bo Nix is. And but yeah, there's like this good Bo, bad Bo kind of dichotomy, and it started from his first game. Well, Oregon fans are very uh, very familiar with Bo Nix's first game. He played like garbage. Oh, until the last 40 seconds of the game. And then all of a sudden, he pulls off a couple amazing plays and pulls it out. I think he's a very talented guy. You're going to pull your hair out a little bit if he's allowed to be who he is. And I think he's reined it in a little bit. And to his defense, he's had a different offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach over
Yeah,
and over.
it's been a revolving door, and that's a
Yeah,
tough thing to deal with.
yeah. And so he's not been very disciplined, at least early in his career. But I think, if you look at Auburn's season last year, they were a pretty good football team until he got hurt. And then they just fell off the tracks. I don't think he's an elite quarterback, but I think he's going to be exciting. And I think if he can find that, and I think he has at times, and I watch quite a bit of SEC football and Auburn football, that he has been able to take coaching and apply it and generally find a good balance of being playmaker, but not crazy, throw it up for grabs, run like a crazy man in the backfield, doing circles back and forth across the field. So I think he's an upgrade. I do think he's an upgrade from what you had last season.
Oregon fans certainly hoping that that's the case, and we'll be hoping to have you back on the show sometime in the future. Mark Rogers, the voice of college football on YouTube, at Mark Rogers TV on Twitter. Great to meet you and great to have you on the show. Thanks for taking the time.
Spencer, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I appreciate everybody listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.